The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert floor when Eleanor first appeared at the edge of Frank Whitman's ranch. She stood there like a figure from another time, wearing a faded blue dress that had seen better decades and carrying nothing but a small cloth bag that looked as weathered as the woman herself. Frank was 73 that spring and had lived on this land for most of his adult life. He knew every rock and every stubborn patch of earth that refused to grow anything but the hardiest desert plants. When he saw the woman standing there, he set down his coffee cup and walked slowly toward the fence that separated his property from the endless stretch of public land beyond. Eleanor looked up at him with eyes that held stories he could only imagine. Her face was lined with the kind of wrinkles that come not just from age but from years of squinting into harsh sunlight and harder truths. She was perhaps 65, maybe 70. It was difficult to tell because the desert had a way of aging people in ways that defied simple counting of years. "Morning," Frank said in the quiet way that people who live alone often speak. His voice carried the gentle roughness that comes from years of talking more to animals than to people. "I was wondering," Eleanor said, and her voice was softer than he expected, "if you might have work for someone like me." Frank studied her for a long moment. He had learned over the decades that the desert brought all kinds of people to his doorstep. Some were running from something and others were running towards something they hoped might be better than what they had left behind. Eleanor seemed to be doing neither. She appeared to be someone who had simply arrived at a place where arriving felt right. "What kind of work you looking for?" he asked, though he suspected she would take whatever he might offer. "Anything honest," she replied. "I know my way around horses and I can cook well enough to keep a person fed." Frank nodded slowly. The truth was he had been managing the ranch mostly by himself since his wife Margaret had passed 3 years earlier. The place had gotten lonely in ways that surprised him. He had always considered himself someone who preferred solitude, but Margaret's absence had shown him the difference between choosing to be alone and having loneliness choose you. "There's a small cabin out back," he said finally, "used to house seasonal workers but nobody's lived in it for a while." Eleanor's face brightened in a way that made Frank realize how long it had been since he had given someone good news. "It's not much," he continued, "but it's got running water and electricity, and if you're handy with basic repairs you could probably make it comfortable enough." "I'm handy enough," Eleanor said, "and I don't need much comfort." That afternoon Frank showed Eleanor to the cabin. It was a simple structure with whitewashed walls that had faded to the color of old bones and a small porch that faced east toward the mountains. Inside there was a bed with a mattress that had seen better days, a small kitchen with basic appliances, and a sitting area with a chair positioned perfectly to catch the morning light. Eleanor walked through the space slowly, running her fingers along the windowsills and checking the faucets with the practiced eye of someone who had learned not to take running water for granted. "This will do just fine," she said, and Frank could hear genuine gratitude in her voice. Over the following weeks Eleanor settled into life on the ranch with the ease of someone who had learned to make herself at home wherever circumstances required. She rose before dawn and was already working in the small vegetable garden behind the main house by the time Frank emerged for his morning coffee. She moved through her tasks with quiet efficiency, feeding the horses, checking the fence lines, and maintaining the equipment with a competence that surprised Frank. He had expected to need to teach her most things, but Eleanor seemed to understand the rhythms of ranch life instinctively. She cooked simple meals that reminded Frank of the food his grandmother had made decades earlier. Nothing fancy, but everything prepared with care and attention to the small details that make the difference between mere sustenance and genuine nourishment. In the evenings they often sat on Frank's front porch watching the desert transform in the changing light. They didn't talk much at first, but the silence between them was comfortable rather than awkward. Frank began to look forward to these quiet interludes in ways that surprised him. Eleanor had a way of being present without demanding attention. She seemed content to simply exist in the same space without feeling the need to fill every moment with conversation. As summer deepened into fall, Eleanor began to share small pieces of her story. She had grown up on a farm in Kansas, she told Frank. Had married young to a man who worked construction and had followed him from job to job across half the country. They had never had children, though not for lack of trying. Her husband had passed away 5 years earlier, and she had spent the time since then wandering from place to place, working whatever jobs she could find and discovering that home was less about location and more about finding people who made you feel like you belonged somewhere. I've been in a lot of places, she said one evening as they watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky, but I never felt like I was supposed to be anywhere until I came here. Frank understood what she meant. The ranch had been his refuge for so many years that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to share it with someone who appreciated its particular brand of peace. Eleanor brought a different energy to the place. Not disruptive but complementary. Like adding harmony to a melody that had grown too familiar. As winter approached, Eleanor began to show signs that Frank recognized but didn't want to acknowledge. She moved more slowly in the mornings and sometimes paused in her work as if gathering strength for the next task. She ate less at meals, though she continued to cook with the same care and attention. When Frank asked if she was feeling all right, she smiled and said she was just getting older like everyone else. But Frank had seen enough aging to know the difference between the gradual decline that comes with years and something more urgent. One morning in early December, Frank found Eleanor collapsed in the garden. She was conscious but pale and breathing with difficulty. He helped her into the house and called for an ambulance despite her protests that she was fine and just needed to rest for a minute. At the hospital, the doctor spoke to Frank in the hallway outside Eleanor's room. The words came in medical terminology that Frank didn't fully understand, but the meaning was clear enough. Eleanor was dying. The cancer had spread beyond treatment, and the kindest thing now was to make her as comfortable as possible. When Frank returned to Eleanor's bedside, she was sitting up and looking out the window toward the mountains. "How long?" she asked without preamble. Frank appreciated her directness. "Doctor says maybe a few months." Eleanor nodded as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. "I have a favor to ask," she said, turning to face Frank directly. "I want to come home with you." Frank felt something tight in his chest. "The doctor says you need care." "The doctor says I need to be comfortable and peaceful," Eleanor corrected, "and I can't think of anywhere. I'd be more comfortable than on your ranch." Frank drove Eleanor home the next morning. He had converted the guest room in the main house so she would be closer to help if she needed it. But Eleanor insisted on returning to her small cabin. "It's my place now," she said, "and I want to spend whatever time I have left in my own space." Frank respected her wishes, though he installed a bell system so she could call for help if needed. Over the following weeks, Eleanor continued to move through her days with as much normalcy as her condition allowed. She still rose early, though she stayed in bed longer than before. She still tended to small tasks around the cabin, though Frank took over most of the heavier ranch work. She still cooked meals, though they were simpler now, and Frank found himself eating more meals in her small kitchen than in his own. One evening in January, as they sat together watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Eleanor spoke quietly. "I've been thinking about where I want to be buried." Frank felt the words hit him harder than he had expected. "There's a cemetery in town," he said. Eleanor shook her head. "I was hoping," she said, "that you might let me stay here." Frank looked at her carefully. "Here meaning?" "Here on the ranch," Eleanor said. "There's a spot up on the ridge where you can see the whole valley." Frank knew the place she meant. It was where he and Margaret had often gone in the evenings when they wanted to watch the stars without any artificial light interfering. "I know it's asking a lot," Eleanor continued, "but this place feels like home in a way nowhere else ever has." Frank was quiet for a long time. Finally he said, "We'd have to check with the county about permits and such." Eleanor smiled. "Is that a yes?" "That's a we'll figure it out." The paperwork turned out to be more complicated than Frank had anticipated, but not impossible. The county allowed private burial on agricultural land provided certain conditions were met. Frank found himself spending hours on the phone with various offices learning about soil requirements and setback distances and the dozen other regulations that governed such things. Eleanor watched his efforts with quiet amusement. "You don't have to do all this," she said one afternoon as Frank hung up the phone after another lengthy conversation with a county clerk. "I want to," Frank said, and realized as he spoke the words how true they were. Eleanor's condition worsened gradually through February. She spent more time resting and less time moving around the cabin. Frank began bringing her meals and staying to eat with her. They talked more during these weeks than they had in all the months before. Eleanor told Frank about her childhood on the Kansas farm, about the husband she had loved and lost, about the places she had seen in her wandering years. Frank found himself sharing stories he hadn't told anyone since Margaret died. About the early years of building the ranch, about the dreams he and Margaret had shared, about the quiet satisfaction he found in working with his hands and living close to the land. One morning in early March, Frank arrived at Eleanor's cabin to find her still in bed. She was awake but breathing with obvious difficulty. "I think it's time," she said simply. Frank sat beside her bed. "Is there anyone you want me to call?" Eleanor shook her head. "There's no one left who would remember me well enough to grieve properly." Frank felt the weight of that statement. "I'll remember you," he said. Eleanor smiled. "I know you will." She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. "The spot on the ridge," she said, "will you take me there?" Frank understood what she was asking. "Now." Eleanor nodded. Frank gathered blankets and pillows and helped Eleanor into his truck. The drive up to the ridge was slow and careful over the rough trail that wound between the desert plants and rocky outcroppings. When they reached the spot Eleanor had chosen, Frank spread the blankets on the ground and helped her settle in a position where she could see the entire valley spread below them. The morning sun was warm on their faces and the air held the clean scent that comes after desert rain. Eleanor lay back against the pillows and closed her eyes. "This is perfect," she whispered. Frank sat beside her, holding her hand and watching the play of light and shadow across the landscape they both loved. Eleanor's breathing grew slower and more peaceful as the morning progressed. She spoke occasionally in fragments. About the beauty of the desert morning, about how grateful she was to have found this place, about how peaceful she felt. Frank listened and responded when response seemed called for, but mostly he simply stayed present. Being witness to Eleanor's final hours felt like both a privilege and a responsibility. She died just before noon as a red-tailed hawk circled overhead. Frank sat with her for a long time after her breathing stopped. The desert was completely quiet except for the whisper of wind through the sagebrush. When Frank finally stood, he realized that something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of what it meant to care for another person. Eleanor had asked to be buried here and Frank had said yes. But in the end it had become about more than honoring her final wish. It had become about recognizing that some connections between people transcend the practical considerations of life and death. Frank buried Eleanor that afternoon in the spot where she had died. He dug the grave himself, working slowly in the desert soil and thinking about the strange journey that had brought this woman into his life. As he worked, he found himself talking to Eleanor as if she could still hear him. Telling her about the view she would have from this resting place, about how the sunrise would touch this ridge every morning, about how he would visit when the loneliness got too heavy. When the work was finished, Frank fashioned a simple marker from a piece of sandstone he found nearby. He carved Eleanor's name and the years of her birth and death using tools from his workshop. Below her name he added the words she had spoken that first morning when she appeared at his fence. Looking for something honest. Frank visits Eleanor's grave regularly now. He brings coffee sometimes and sits on the ridge drinking it while watching the sun rise over the valley. He tells her about the changes in the seasons, about the wildlife he's spotted, about the small events that make up the rhythm of ranch life. The conversations feel natural and necessary. Eleanor had been right about the view. From her resting place you could see the entire sweep of the valley, from the mountains in the east to the desert stretching endlessly toward the west. It was a view that seemed to encompass all the beauty and all the harsh honesty of the landscape they had both come to love. Frank is 74 now and beginning to think about his own mortality in ways he hadn't before Eleanor's arrival. He has made his own arrangements with the county. When his time comes, he wants to be buried near Eleanor on the ridge where they can continue to share the morning coffee and the evening stars. The ranch feels different now. Less lonely, but not in ways Frank would have expected. Eleanor's presence lingers not as a ghost or a memory, but as a reminder that kindness and connection can emerge in the most unlikely circumstances. That sometimes the most important relationships begin when people stop running toward or away from things and simply allow themselves to arrive wherever they find themselves called to be. Frank has learned that home is less about the place and more about the willingness to let another person matter. That caring for someone in their final days is not a burden but a gift. That some stories don't have dramatic climaxes or surprising plot twists. Instead, they unfold slowly like desert flowers blooming after rain, with quiet beauty and profound meaning found in the simple act of staying present for another person's journey. The ranch continues its ancient rhythms. The sun rises and sets. The seasons turn. The desert blooms and rests and blooms again. And on the ridge overlooking the valley, two friends share the endless conversation of those who have learned that the most important human connections transcend the boundaries that separate the living from the dead. Frank tends his land and his animals and visits the ridge where Eleanor rests. He has found peace in the knowledge that some kindnesses echo forward through time. That the decision to say yes when someone asks for help or comfort or simply a place to belong can transform not just their life but your own. That the desert has its own wisdom about what matters and what endures. And that sometimes the most profound human connections begin with the simple words. Morning, I was wondering if you might have work for someone like me.